The crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow across the marble floors of the Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom. Soft music floated through the air as waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying champagne flutes and delicate appetizers. Everything about this evening screamed luxury and perfection. From the white orchid centerpieces to the guests dressed in designer gowns and expensive suits, this was the engagement celebration of the year, and everyone who mattered in the city had received an invitation. Elizabeth Hayes moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency. Her simple black uniform a stark contrast to the elaborate dresses surrounding her. She balanced a silver tray loaded with champagne glasses, careful not to bump into any of the important guests. This was her 5th year working at the Grand Meridian, and she had seen countless events like this one. Wealthy people celebrating their perfect lives while she worked double shifts to pay rent and buy groceries for her daughter. Tonight was supposed to be straightforward. Serve drinks, smile politely, collect her pay, and go home to Sophie. But circumstances had forced her to bring her 5-year-old daughter to work. The babysitter had canceled at the last minute, and Elizabeth simply could not afford to lose this job. Her supervisor had reluctantly agreed to let Sophie stay in the back room near the kitchen, as long as she remained quiet and out of sight. Sophie sat on a folding chair behind the service area, coloring in her princess book with broken crayons. She was a bright child with curious brown eyes that noticed everything. Her mother had given her strict instructions to stay put and be good, and Sophie intended to follow them. But it was hard for a 5-year-old to resist peeking at all the beautiful people and fancy decorations just beyond the doorway. At the center of the ballroom stood Carter Montgomery, a man whose name appeared regularly in business magazines and financial news. At 34, he had built a technology empire that revolutionized data security systems. His company was valued at over $2 billion, and his influence extended into multiple industries. He was tall, with sharp features, dark hair touched with early gray at the temples, and an air of confidence that came from years of success. Tonight he wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, standing beside his fiancée as photographers captured their picture. Vanessa Sterling clung to his arm with a radiant smile. She was beautiful in an calculated way, her blonde hair styled in perfect waves, her makeup applied by professionals, her designer dress hugging her figure in all the right places. But the most notable feature of her appearance was her rounded belly, prominently displayed as she rested one hand protectively over it. She was 5 months pregnant, or so she claimed, carrying the heir to the Montgomery fortune. The engagement had been sudden. Carter and Vanessa had dated for only 8 months before she announced the pregnancy. His family had been skeptical, but Carter was a man of honor. If he was going to be a father, he would marry the mother of his child and provide the stability a family needed. His own parents had divorced when he was young, and he was determined not to repeat their mistakes. Vanessa played her role perfectly. She spoke constantly about baby names, nursery colors, and parenting books. She attended prenatal yoga classes and posted photos on social media showing her growing bump. She had even produced ultrasound images and doctor notes confirming the pregnancy. Everything seemed legitimate, and Carter, busy with his company and merger negotiations, had no reason to doubt her. Elizabeth refilled glasses at the main table where Carter and Vanessa sat, surrounded by family and close friends. She kept her eyes down, invisible as most servers were to people of this status. Vanessa barely glanced at her, too focused on accepting compliments and posing for more photographs. The woman touched her belly constantly, a gesture that seemed rehearsed rather than instinctive. Sophie had grown restless in the back room. She stood up and wandered closer to the ballroom entrance, staying in the shadows but watching the party with wide eyes. She saw the pretty lady in the white dress, the one everyone kept taking pictures of. The lady kept touching her tummy, and Sophie thought that was strange. Her best friend's mother had been pregnant last year, and her belly had looked different, softer and more natural. This lady's belly looked hard and round, almost like it was stuffed with something. The evening progressed with speeches and toasts. Vanessa's father, a prominent attorney named Richard Sterling, stood to congratulate the couple. He spoke about family legacy, about the joy of becoming a grandfather, about the bright future ahead. His words were smooth and practiced, the speech of a man accustomed to courtrooms and persuasion. Carter listened politely, though Elizabeth noticed he seemed distracted, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. When the speeches ended, Vanessa announced she wanted to say a few words. The room quieted as she stood, one hand on her belly, the other reaching for the microphone. She spoke about love, about unexpected blessings, about how grateful she was for this new chapter in her life. The guests applauded. Cameras flashed. Everything was going exactly as planned. Sophie had moved closer now, standing near a potted plant at the edge of the ballroom. She watched the lady in white talk about her baby, but something felt wrong. Children have an instinct for dishonesty that adults often lose, and Sophie's young mind could sense that something about this woman was not real. The words came out before Elizabeth could stop them. Sophie stepped forward from her hiding spot, her small voice cutting through the applause with perfect clarity. That lady is not having a baby. Her belly is fake. The room froze. Every head turned toward the source of the voice. Sophie stood there in her worn pink dress and scuffed shoes, pointing directly at Vanessa with the honest certainty only a child possesses. Elizabeth felt her heart drop into her stomach. She rushed forward, mortified, reaching for her daughter. Vanessa's face went pale beneath her makeup. For just a moment, genuine fear flashed in her eyes before anger replaced it. She stared at the child with undisguised hatred, her carefully constructed facade cracking. The guests began whispering among themselves, confusion and shock rippling through the crowd. Carter looked from Sophie to Vanessa, his expression unreadable. Something in his posture changed, a tension entering his shoulders. He had noticed his fiancée's reaction, the way she had recoiled, not with hurt or confusion, but with guilt and rage. Elizabeth grabbed Sophie and tried to apologize, her voice shaking. She could feel everyone staring at them, judging them. These working-class intruders who had disrupted the perfect evening. Vanessa found her voice and began to scream. How dare this child make such accusations? How dare this woman bring her daughter to a private event? She demanded they be removed immediately. But then something fell from Vanessa's designer clutch as she gestured wildly. A rounded object tumbled out and rolled across the floor, coming to rest near Carter's feet. He bent down slowly and picked it up. It was a prosthetic pregnancy belly, the kind used in theater productions, complete with straps and padding. The silence that followed was deafening. Vanessa reached for the prosthetic, trying to snatch it away, but Carter held it beyond her reach. He stared at it, then at her, then at the rounded belly beneath her dress. His face showed no emotion, but his jaw tightened. The truth hung in the air, undeniable and devastating. Guests pulled out their phones. Photographers captured the moment. Vanessa's perfect lie unraveled in seconds, destroyed by the innocent observation of a 5-year-old girl who simply told what she saw. Elizabeth stood frozen. Sophie clutched in her arms, both of them at the center of a scandal that would change everything. She had no idea that this single moment would set off a chain of events involving lawsuits, threats, investigations, and eventually something she never expected: the attention and protection of Carter Montgomery himself. The engagement party ended in chaos. But the real story was only beginning. The morning after the engagement party, Elizabeth woke to find her phone flooded with notifications. Someone had posted video footage of the incident online, and it had spread across social media like wildfire. The clip showed Sophie's innocent declaration, the prosthetic belly falling to the floor, and Vanessa's face twisted in rage. Within hours, it had millions of views. Elizabeth sat at her small kitchen table, hands shaking as she scrolled through the comments. Some people praised Sophie for telling the truth. Others accused Elizabeth of orchestrating the entire scene for attention or money. The worst comments suggested she was trying to trap Carter Montgomery herself. Using her daughter as a pawn in some elaborate scheme, Sophie ate her cereal quietly, unaware of the storm she had created. She hummed a tune from her favorite cartoon, occasionally looking up at her mother with those trusting brown eyes. Elizabeth forced a smile and told her everything would be fine, even though she had no idea if that was true. By noon, Elizabeth received a letter delivered by courier. It was from Sterling & Associates, the law firm owned by Vanessa's father. The legal language was dense and intimidating. But the message was clear. Elizabeth was being sued for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and child exploitation. The letter claimed she had trained Sophie to make false accusations in public to damage Vanessa's reputation. They were seeking damages in excess of $5 million. Elizabeth could barely breathe as she read the document. $5 million. She made barely enough to cover rent and groceries each month. This lawsuit would destroy her completely. Even if she won, the legal fees alone would bankrupt her. She thought about Sophie, about losing their apartment, about losing custody if they painted, or as an unfit mother who used her child for malicious purposes. She called the only lawyer she could afford, a public defender named Rita Chen, who handled cases for low-income families. Rita came to her apartment that evening, reviewed the documents, and delivered the hard truth. The Sterling family had unlimited resources and political connections. They could drag this case out for years, bleeding Elizabeth dry, even if the accusations were baseless. But then Rita said something unexpected. She had received a call that afternoon from Thomas Brennan, Carter Montgomery's personal attorney. He wanted to meet with them to discuss the case. Rita advised caution, unsure of his motives, but Elizabeth agreed to the meeting. She had nothing left to lose. The next day, they met at a neutral location, a small conference room in a downtown office building. Thomas Brennan was a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and a reputation for winning impossible cases. He sat across from Elizabeth and got straight to the point. Carter Montgomery believed Sophie had told the truth. He had spent the past 2 days investigating Vanessa's pregnancy claims and had uncovered disturbing inconsistencies. The ultrasound images she had shown him were stock photos downloaded from the internet. The doctor's notes bore the signature of a physician who did not exist in any medical database. The prenatal appointments she claimed to attend had no corresponding records at any hospital or clinic. Thomas explained that Carter wanted to help Elizabeth defend herself against the lawsuit. More than that, he wanted to expose Vanessa's fraud completely. He was prepared to testify on Elizabeth's behalf and provide financial support for her legal defense. In exchange, he asked only that Elizabeth tell the truth about what happened that night. Elizabeth was stunned. She had expected the wealthy businessman to side with his fiancée, to use his power to crush the waitress who had embarrassed him publicly. Instead, he was offering her a lifeline. She asked why he would do this, and Thomas gave her a simple answer. Carter valued truth above all else. He despised being manipulated. Over the following weeks, the investigation deepened. Thomas hired a team of private investigators who uncovered a trail of deception. They found the costume shop where Vanessa had purchased the prosthetic belly 3 months earlier. They located the graphic designer she had paid to create fake medical documents. They even discovered emails between Vanessa and her mother discussing how to maintain the pregnancy. Charade long enough to secure the marriage and access to Carter's fortune. The most damaging? Evidence came from an unexpected source. A woman named Jennifer Park came forward voluntarily. She had worked as Vanessa's personal assistant for 2 years before being fired. Abruptly, 3 weeks before the engagement party, Jennifer had been bitter about her dismissal, but she had kept silent out of fear. Now, seeing the lawsuit against Elizabeth, her conscience would not let her stay quiet any longer. Jennifer provided text messages, photographs, and recorded phone conversations. She testified that Vanessa had confided the entire plan to her, bragging about how easy it was to fool Carter. Vanessa had researched his background and knew he came from a broken home. She calculated that a pregnancy would trigger his sense of honor and responsibility, pushing him toward marriage before he could examine her claims too closely. The plan was to fake a miscarriage after the wedding, then use her position as his wife to negotiate a lucrative divorce settlement. Jennifer also revealed something darker. Vanessa had explicitly targeted Carter because of his wealth, methodically inserting herself into his social circles and engineering their first meeting. Everything about their relationship had been calculated and false from the beginning, as the evidence mounted. The Sterling family's legal strategy shifted. They could no longer sustain the narrative that Sophie had lied. Instead, they pivoted to attacking Elizabeth directly, claiming she was an opportunist who saw a chance to get close to a billionaire. Anonymous social media accounts appeared, posting allegations about Elizabeth's past, suggesting she had a history of relationships with wealthy men, implying she was coaching Sophie to manipulate situations for financial gain. None of it was true. But the attacks took their toll. Elizabeth's supervisor at the Grand Meridian called to inform her that she was being placed on indefinite suspension pending resolution of the legal matter. The hotel could not afford the negative publicity. Elizabeth's small savings disappeared quickly. She struggled to pay rent and buy food for Sophie. One evening, Carter came to her apartment himself. It was the first time they had spoken directly since the engagement party. He stood in her modest living room, looking strangely out of place among the second-hand furniture and worn carpet. He told her he was sorry, that she should never have been dragged into his mess, that he took responsibility for not seeing through Vanessa's lies sooner. Elizabeth, exhausted and scared, told him she did not blame him. Sophie had simply said what she observed. Neither of them could have predicted the consequences. They talked for over an hour, and Carter learned about Elizabeth's life. About working multiple jobs after Sophie's father abandoned them. About struggling to provide stability for her daughter while barely keeping their heads above water. Something shifted in that conversation. Carter had spent years surrounded by people who wanted things from him, who saw him as a means to wealth and status. Elizabeth wanted nothing except to protect her child and survive. Her honesty was refreshing. Her strength in the face of overwhelming odds was admirable. He found himself thinking about her long after he left her apartment. The intimidation tactics escalated. Elizabeth noticed cars following her when she took Sophie to school. Unknown callers left threatening voicemails suggesting she'd drop the case and disappear if she knew what was good for her. One night, someone spray-painted the word liar across her apartment door. The police took a report but could do nothing without evidence of who was responsible. Rita Chen filed for a restraining order and requested protective measures. Thomas Brennan made it clear to the Sterling legal team that any further harassment would result in additional criminal charges. The pressure was building on both sides. Everyone knew this was heading toward a courtroom confrontation that would determine not just the lawsuit's outcome, but the truth about Vanessa's elaborate deception. Carter found himself increasingly involved in Elizabeth's defense, attending strategy meetings, reviewing evidence, preparing his testimony. He spent time with Sophie, bringing her books and art supplies, treating her to ice cream while her mother met with lawyers. The little girl who had exposed the lie reminded him of what mattered: honesty, kindness, and seeing the world with unclouded eyes. Elizabeth noticed the way Carter looked at her, the way his expression softened when Sophie laughed, the way he seemed more relaxed in their simple apartment than he ever appeared in photographs at society events. She tried not to read too much into it. He was helping her because it was the right thing to do, nothing more. But late at night, when Sophie was asleep and Elizabeth lay awake worrying about the future, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like if Carter's interest was more than just moral support. She quickly pushed the thought away. She was a struggling single mother, and he was a billionaire. Their worlds did not intersect, except through this crisis. Once it ended, he would return to his life and she would rebuild hers. Neither of them realized how wrong that assumption would prove to be. The court date was set for 6 weeks away. Both sides prepared their cases, gathering evidence and lining up witnesses. The media attention intensified. Talk shows debated the incident. Online forums dissected every detail. The story had everything people loved: wealth, deception, scandal. And an innocent child caught in the middle, Vanessa remained largely out of sight, releasing only a single statement through her attorney, claiming she was the victim of a conspiracy and that the truth would emerge in court. She appeared in a few carefully staged photographs, always with her hand on her belly, always projecting the image of a wronged woman standing strong. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming in the Sterling family's united front. Richard Sterling knew the evidence against his daughter was damning. He pressured Vanessa to settle quietly, to drop the lawsuit and disappear from public view. She refused, convinced she could still manipulate the situation, still confident that money and influence would prevail over facts. Elizabeth spent those weeks in a state of constant anxiety, preparing her testimony, protecting Sophie from the media circus and trying to maintain some semblance of normal life. Carter became a steady presence, offering support without expecting anything in return. Slowly, carefully, something deeper than gratitude began to grow between them. The night before the trial, Carter called Elizabeth. He told her to be strong, to tell the truth, and to trust that justice would prevail. He said something else too, something that made Elizabeth's heart skip. He told her that regardless of what happened in court, he wanted to keep knowing her and Sophie. This was not just about the case anymore. This was about people he had come to care about. Elizabeth hung up the phone and sat in the dark, hardly daring to hope. Tomorrow would bring answers, vindication or destruction. She held Sophie close and whispered a prayer for strength. The unraveling was complete. Now came the moment of truth. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameras when Elizabeth arrived at 8 in the morning. Rita Chen guided her through the chaos, one hand on her shoulder as microphones thrust toward them and voices shouted questions. Elizabeth kept her head down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. She had left Sophie with a trusted neighbor, not wanting her daughter to witness whatever happened today. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Elizabeth had imagined from television shows, but somehow more intimidating. The wooden benches were hard and uncomfortable. The judge's bench loomed at the front, tall and imposing. Everything smelled of old paper and floor polish. Elizabeth took her seat at the defendant's table, Rita beside her. Thomas Brennan and his team at the adjacent table as allied counsel. Across the aisle sat Vanessa Sterling and her legal team. She wore a pale blue dress with a high waist that emphasized her rounded belly. Her hair was pulled back in a simple style, her makeup minimal. She looked like a mother-to-be facing unjust persecution, exactly the image her attorneys wanted to project. When she glanced at Elizabeth, her eyes were cold and calculating. Richard Sterling sat in the front row behind his daughter, his expression unreadable. Carter sat on Elizabeth's side of the courtroom, dressed in a dark suit, his presence a silent statement of support. Their eyes met briefly and he nodded once. Elizabeth drew strength from that simple gesture. The judge entered. A stern woman in her late 50s named Judge Patricia. Well, she had a reputation for running an efficient courtroom and having little patience for theatrics. Everyone rose, then sat again at her instruction. The proceedings began. The Sterling attorney spoke first, laying out their case. He painted Vanessa as a victim, a pregnant woman publicly humiliated by a staged incident designed to destroy her reputation and derail her engagement. He claimed Elizabeth had coached her daughter to make false accusations, hoping to create a scandal that would somehow benefit them financially. He pointed to the viral video, the social media frenzy, and the emotional distress his client had suffered. When he finished, Rita Chen stood to present the defense. She was calm and methodical, outlining a very different story. She described Sophie as an observant child who simply stated what she saw, with no coaching or manipulation. She promised to present evidence that Vanessa's pregnancy was entirely fabricated, that the real fraud had been committed by the plaintiff, not the defendant. Judge Wells listened to both opening statements, then instructed the plaintiff to call their first witness. Vanessa herself took the stand. She placed one hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, then settled into the witness chair with practiced composure. Under questioning from her attorney, Vanessa described the engagement party, her joy at celebrating with family and friends, and the shock of being accused by a stranger's child. She spoke about the medical confirmation of her pregnancy, the doctor's appointments, the preparations she had made for the baby. She wept delicately as she described the public humiliation and the damage to her reputation. Then Rita Chen stood for cross-examination. She approached the witness stand with a folder in her hands. Her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. Rita began with simple questions. Which doctor had confirmed the pregnancy? Vanessa provided a name, Dr. Harrison Mitchell. Rita asked for the name of the hospital or clinic where Dr. Mitchell practiced. Vanessa hesitated, then named a prestigious medical center downtown. Rita produced a document. It was a letter from that medical center stating that no Dr. Harrison Mitchell had ever been affiliated with their facility. She asked Vanessa to explain. Vanessa stammered, saying she must have been confused about the location. that perhaps it was a different medical group. Rita produced another document. A comprehensive search of medical licensing databases showing no Dr. Harrison Mitchell existed in the entire state. Vanessa's composure began to crack. She claimed the records must be incomplete, that there had to be some mistake. Rita moved to the ultrasound images Vanessa had provided. She displayed them on a screen for the court, then showed identical images available on stock photography websites. The images were pixel-perfect matches, downloaded from the internet, not produced by any medical equipment. Vanessa's face flushed red. She insisted she had simply mixed up which files she sent, that she had the real ultrasounds at home. Judge Wells interrupted, her tone sharp. She asked Vanessa if she had the actual medical records with her today. Vanessa admitted she did not. The judge instructed her to produce them within 24 hours or face contempt charges. Vanessa's attorney objected, arguing this was unexpected, but the judge overruled. If Vanessa was claiming a legitimate pregnancy, she could easily provide legitimate documentation, Rita continued. She asked Vanessa about the prosthetic belly that had fallen from her purse at the engagement party. Vanessa claimed it belonged to a friend who was in a theater production, that she had been holding it temporarily. Rita produced a receipt from a costume shop showing Vanessa herself had purchased the item 3 months earlier. The date was on the receipt, along with a description of the product and Vanessa's signature. The courtroom murmured. Judge Wells called for order. Vanessa tried to explain, her voice rising, but her story kept changing. First, the prosthetic was for a friend, then for a costume party she had attended, then for a prank she never went through with. Each explanation contradicted the last. Thomas Brennan called Carter Montgomery to the stand. Carter described his relationship with Vanessa, the announcement of the pregnancy, and his growing suspicions when details did not add up. He testified about discovering the fake medical documents and the stock photo ultrasounds. He spoke clearly and directly, his credibility unquestionable. Under cross-examination, the Sterling attorney tried to suggest Carter was colluding with Elizabeth, perhaps romantically involved with her, biased against Vanessa. Carter calmly stated he had met Elizabeth only once before the engagement party, when she served drinks at a business dinner months earlier. They had not spoken. He was testifying because the evidence was clear, not because of any relationship. Then Jennifer Park took the stand. She was nervous, her hands trembling slightly, but her testimony was devastating. She described working for Vanessa, hearing her discuss the fake pregnancy plan, helping her maintain the charade. She provided text messages where Vanessa explicitly discussed fooling Carter and securing access to his money. The Sterling attorney attacked her credibility, pointing out she had been fired and might hold a grudge. Jennifer acknowledged the firing but stood by her testimony. She had kept quiet until she saw an innocent woman being sued for telling the truth. Her conscience would not allow her to remain silent any longer. Rita called a handwriting expert who testified that the signature on the fake medical documents did not match any licensed physician's signature on file. She called the owner of the costume shop who confirmed selling the prosthetic belly to Vanessa. She systematically dismantled every aspect of the pregnancy claim by late afternoon. It was clear the case had turned completely. Vanessa's testimony had fallen apart under scrutiny. The evidence of fraud was overwhelming. Judge Wells called both legal teams to approach the bench for a private conference. When they returned, the judge addressed the courtroom. Based on the evidence presented, she was dismissing the case against Elizabeth Hayes with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. Furthermore, she was referring the matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges against Vanessa Sterling for fraud, perjury, and filing a false legal claim. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Richard Sterling sat frozen, his face ashen. Vanessa began to cry, real tears this time, not the delicate ones she had performed earlier. Her attorney tried to argue, but Judge Wells was done listening. She gavelled for order and announced the proceedings were concluded. Elizabeth sat stunned, hardly believing it was over. Rita squeezed her hand, smiling. Thomas Brennan nodded with satisfaction. Carter stood and walked to Elizabeth, helping her to her feet. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe. Outside the courthouse, Rita made a brief statement to the press. Justice had been served. An innocent woman and her daughter had been vindicated. The real fraud had been exposed. She thanked everyone who had supported Elizabeth and emphasized that this case proved truth could prevail even against powerful opponents. Carter stood beside Elizabeth during the statement, a silent but powerful show of support. The cameras captured the moment, and the images would run on every news outlet by evening. The narrative had completely reversed. Elizabeth was no longer the villain, but the hero. The working mother who had been targeted for her daughter's honesty. The district attorney announced an investigation into Vanessa Sterling the following day. She was formally charged with multiple counts of fraud and perjury. Her father, desperate to minimize damage to the family name, negotiated a plea deal. Vanessa would plead guilty to reduce charges, pay substantial fines, perform community service, and face probation. She would never practice law, a career she'd been training for, and her reputation was permanently destroyed. Elizabeth returned to work at the Grand Meridian, where the management apologized for the suspension and offered her a promotion to event coordinator with better pay and regular hours. She accepted gratefully, was finally able to provide more stability for Sophie. But the biggest change came in her relationship with Carter. After the trial, he did not disappear back into his world of boardrooms and business deals. He continued to call, to visit, to spend time with Elizabeth and Sophie. What had begun as support during a crisis evolved into genuine friendship, and then into something deeper. Carter discovered that Elizabeth challenged him in ways no one else did. She was not impressed by his wealth or status. She valued honesty, hard work, and kindness, the same things he had lost sight of in his pursuit of success. Sophie reminded him how to laugh, how to play, how to see wonder in simple things. Being with them felt like coming home after years of wandering. Elizabeth had been alone for so long, carrying every burden herself, that accepting help felt foreign. But Carter was patient. He showed her through actions, not words, that his feelings were real. He attended Sophie's school play, sitting in the audience and applauding louder than anyone. He helped Elizabeth move to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. He treated them both with respect and genuine care. 6 months after the trial, Carter took Elizabeth to dinner at a quiet restaurant far from the society pages and gossip columns. Over dessert, he told her he had learned something important from the whole terrible experience with Vanessa. He had learned that real love was not about appearances or social status or carefully constructed images. It was about truth, about finding someone who saw you clearly and chose you anyway. He told Elizabeth that she and Sophie had changed his life. They had shown him what actually mattered. He was not asking her to marry him, not yet, but he wanted her to know his intentions were serious. He wanted to build a future together if she was willing. Elizabeth looked across the table at this man who had started as a stranger, become an ally, and transformed into someone she loved. She thought about the journey they had taken, the trial that had threatened to destroy her, but instead had brought them together. She smiled and told him she was willing, more than willing. They took things slowly, building their relationship on a foundation of trust and respect. Sophie adored Carter, and he adored her right back, eventually adopting her legally and giving her the father figure she had never known. A year later, Carter proposed properly, with a ring and a heartfelt speech and Sophie's enthusiastic approval. The wedding was nothing like the engagement party that had brought them together. It was small and intimate, just family and close friends, held in a garden rather than a ballroom. Sophie was the flower girl, beaming with pride. Elizabeth wore a simple dress that made her feel beautiful without trying to be someone she was not. Carter could not stop smiling as they exchanged vows. Elizabeth thought about that night at the Grand Meridian when her world had seemed to collapse. Sophie's innocent words had exposed a lie, but they had also revealed a truth. Sometimes the things that seem like disasters are actually redirections, painful at the time, but leading toward something better than you could have planned. Vanessa's deception had been cruel and calculated, but it had failed. Truth had prevailed. And from the ashes of that scandal, something beautiful had grown. A family built on honesty, a love built on respect, in a future full of possibilities. Sophie, now 7 years old, stood beside her mother and her new father, holding their hands as the minister pronounced them married. She had been right that night at the party. The lady's belly had been fake, but she had given the world something real in return, the truth, and that truth had set them all free. As Carter and Elizabeth kissed to seal their vows, surrounded by people who genuinely loved them, the past finally released its grip. They were no longer defined by scandal or struggle. They were simply a family, imperfect and real and whole. The champagne at this celebration was earned, not staged. The smiles were genuine. The future was theirs too, right? And it all began because a 5-year-old girl said what she saw, and a mother stood by her daughter. And a man chose truth over comfort. Justice had prevailed. But more importantly, love had prevailed.